So first of all, hello and welcome to another Wet Cement Press kitchen table event. You guys, if you could just take a moment to check your mute settings. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Zoom in a few minutes and how to make it optimal for this event. But right now I can hear people's voices. So if you want to just double check, that would be great. Anyway, I'll introduce myself. I'm Thurl Lovell, the publisher of Wet Cement Press, which is a new press based here in Berkeley, California. I'd like to mention and thank the other editors, Barbara Rother in Asheville, North Carolina, and Micheal Murphy in Reno, Nevada, as well as our two interns, Kelsey and Izzy, for all of their help. So as you guys know, our guest today is Micheal Sohn, who's going to be discussing his new book, Still Forms, Visual Poetry. I'm going to try to streamline my intro to give Micheal a little bit more time. So if you'd like to know more about the press, read up a little bit more about Micheal's book, please go to our website, which is wetcementpress.com. We're also on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and it would be great to connect with all of you on those platforms as well. For those of you who don't know, Micheal grew up in the Massachusetts town that spawned Mary Had a Little Lamb. He has lived in Chicago, spent a whole lifetime in New York City, and presently lives in Marseille, France with his wife. For too many years, he taught freshman composition in New York City while working on his own poems, reading and writing about contemporary French poetry, and thinking about the relationship between text and image, the visual arts and poetry. Meant to be seen more than read, Still Forms is a tour de force, a visual tour de force, which is also emotionally engaging, intellectually stimulating, and just plain fun to flip through. Influenced by Mallarmé and Apollinaire's calligrams and Pierre Reverdy's early poems, Sohn explores the page as a space and the image the poem can leave in that space. But Still Forms is a book that rejects the idea of reading, particularly reading out loud. So each visible poem is a silent response to the work of a visual artist transposed into the material of language, letters and letter forms combined in surprising ways. In other words, Still Forms is not a book to give a reading from. So instead, Micheal is going to do a kind of show and tell, where he'll discuss pages from the book as well as some of the art that inspired them, and then talk about his process of moving from one to the other. Still Forms is going to be available to the world in September, but can be pre-ordered now from our website with 15% off if you use the promo code StillForms15, and I'll mention that again later. And by the way, those of you who have ordered books, first of all, thank you very much. It's great to see the orders come through. I want to let you know that I have started mailing those books out, and I expect all of the books to be mailed out by the end of next week. So I apologize for the delay. There was a little bit of a delay getting the books from the printer, but all that has been resolved and your books are most definitely on the way. So after Micheal's presentation, he's going to be joined by our resident Zen monk. Perhaps every press should have a resident Zen monk. Our resident Zen monk is Nenzo John Hai, and he will be joining Micheal for a short conversation. So with that, let's welcome Micheal Sohn, who is joining us from Salt Lake City.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for making the journey to your couch or kitchen table for the reading. I might also like to thank you, Thoreau, for your sharp editorial eye and for really making a beautiful, beautiful book. So don't be afraid. I'm only going to talk for about 20 minutes, which is not a very easy thing for me to do. But so just kind of keep that in mind. And before we begin the slideshow, I would like to say a few words about my book and about kind of what I was thinking about as I was working on it over the years. So in order to read, one ceases, at least for long moments, to be conscious of seeing words in page and book. Actively looking makes reading as reading nearly impossible, but not words. They remain to be seen. But are words words when seen rather than read? Like with all things, yes and no. Nearly each poem of my book, Still Forms, reacts to a body of visual artwork, as Thoreau said. One might call them ekphrastic poems if it weren't embarrassing to toss old Greek words around. There is a long tradition of ekphrastic poetry. Achilles' shield in the Iliad, for instance, or Keats's Grecian urn. Ekphrastic poems, though, don't merely, or for me even primarily, describe an artwork, but rather attempt to transpose material resistances. Some professor in some book once said something more or less similar. To varying degrees and methods, the poems in my book try to transpose material resistances. Language is material for me, first and foremost. That means, among other things, that words are words, graphic sound knots. If they refer to anything, they refer first and foremost to other words, not to things or ideas or some putative expressible or expressive world, be it interior or exterior. No lyric. Language's possibilities and its charm lie precisely in its impersonal failures. The turn towards other expressive media in my work over the years is therefore nothing other than a return to language as matter and material and as writing. Words, letters, sounds, the page bound and folded into a book, and when absolutely impossible to avoid, some sort of sense. So if we could start the slideshow, Thoreau.
Okay, give me just a second.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about, this first poem. So this is one of the
So how does this look, Michael, before you get going? Are you seeing this already?
Yeah, it looks perfect.
Okay.
And I'm going to be referencing for the Mary Schendel poem, the epigraphs. So feel free to read them as I'm talking or instead of my talking. So this is actually one of the first ekphrastic poems I wrote, and it tries to transliterate aspects of Schendel's work, especially the space and visibility of Schendel's writing objects, while at the same time commenting on or trying to think about them. So this poem is perhaps more visual than visible compared to the other poems in my book, and certainly still this side of readable. It's kind of a furtive attempt to enter the sensibility of her work and translate that sensibility into a textual and lexical space. So if you can flip to the next slide, Thoreau. So the first body of her work that I reacted to were her monotypes. For her, as you can see in the epigraph, they were connected to moments of inscription of words. And if you flip to the next image, you'll actually see an example of one of her monotypes. This is it. And this is her process. She would put ink or oil on a surface and then cover that ink with talcum powder, and then place on top of that a really thin piece of Japanese paper. She would then press into the paper with an object or often with her fingernail, and the ink would seep into the paper from the bottom side. So the paper is not a surface, but a thickness, a space, and the writing comes through to the surface, and it isn't placed or inscribed on it. And I think that resonates with the epigraphs that you just saw. The corporality of the moment of inscription, the materiality of the process of writing and of writing's materials, and particularly with her work, its kind of improvisatory and dangerous nature. There's no going back, there's no possibility of erasure, and her materials are so delicate, there's always a risk of tearing. So if you can flip to the next slide, you'll see one of the pages I fabricated after her work, thinking about her work. So on this page, sound is as visible or as visual as sense. You read hours in terms of time, but you see H and hours in terms of the possessive, or the inverse. So this page is kind of addressing time, possessiveness, singular, plural. Hour and hour are near homophones, depending on whether you aspirate that H or not. So what we see and what we hear don't necessarily coincide. And kind of all my work tries to play on that tension between what we see and what we hear. What's visible is a bell and its tongue, made visible by the readable word ring. But that bell is immediately contradicted by the consonant that gives it a body, the H, which is essentially breath. So that stresses the individual moment, discourse at the moment of utterance, immediate experience, kind of all those things that Schendel was bringing up in her epigraphs. You might think of a famous line of Rilke from the Sonnet to Orpheus, that true singing is a different breath, about nothing, a gust inside the god, a wind, and that's certainly a line that Schendel would have known. Bell and hours have religious connotations in some of Schendel's monotypes, including the one you just saw, obsessively repeat psalms or Bible passages. So what I was kind of interested in this page was creating waves of possible allusions, both to and away from her work, depending on what I saw, what I've read, what she might have read, and obviously what you have read and seen that you're bringing to both my page and also to her work. If you go to the next slide, Thoreau. The next body of her work that I wrote poems after are called the Droginas, or Little Nothings. What she described as transitory objects, and if you flip to the next page, you'll see an example. What Schendel would do was take pieces of the same Japanese paper she used for her monotypes, and she would twist them and knot them together. So the knots along a twisted up line of paper have been compared, and I can't remember if that was by her or by a critic I read, to words in a phrase, or they can be seen as a sort of syntax, blank and without words, but with the syntactic knots where words should be. And they're absolutely without orientation. They can be hung in any which way, they can be stretched, they can be compacted. They occupy our space and they're meant to be manipulated. So she kind of gives a material version of a dream I've always had of a phrase endlessly malleable in real space. You go to the next page, you will get an example of another one of her Droginas. This one, as you can see, is kind of tightened up as a ball. If you go to the next page, you'll get the first page of my section on the Droginas. So this page and the pages that follow, I give you one more, but I think there are 3 or 4 in this section. My pages function as a single Drogina that's stretched, reoriented, retangled, or broken apart by too much manipulation. Some of the word knots in my poem roughly describe both her Droginas and my text's own manipulation. Words like paltry, letter, hand, weave, ephemeral can reference either of those 2 things. And some of those words make fully visible the gaps between the knot lines. Some of the knots, words that they are, for me, are more sound knots than sense knots, or not. It depends on how you twist what you see and you hear. As knots on a single sheet, or connecting sheets, or on adjacent sheets, syntax is purely visible and spatial more than grammatical. And actually, if you go to the next page, you'll see an example of the shape being reoriented in space. And as you move through this section, the words more and more separate, they change positions in space, and they move away from any kind of grammatical or syntactical sense. They can be read in any order. And the spaces get kind of bigger as you kind of go on. You can go to the next slide, Thoreau. So the next artist that I'm going to be talking about briefly and then showing pages from my book is Carlos Scarpa, who was a architect, interior designer, but also, and I could see Toby is in Venice, which is where Scarpa did a lot of his work. I was interested in the glass works he did for the Venetian glass blowing factory, Venini, in the 30s and 40s. So Scarpa would design the objects, and he would work with the artisans to develop new techniques or adapt traditional ones. My poem also looks at the exhibit I saw of these glass works as an exhibit, as a visible demonstration of the resonance of a diverse set of works occupying a space. At the show, you couldn't look at an individual vessel without seeing the ones surrounding it, nor the transparent display cases further on. You were always looking directly at relation and difference, and probably looking at much more if you were familiar, which I wasn't at the time and still am not, with the Venetian glass tradition or design or Chinese pottery. For me, my main interest in Scarpa was his focus on the purity of shape and color, regardless of utility or of meaning or of even decoration. The beauty of line, shape, color, seemingly absolute, literally left me without words. Of course, his work isn't absolute and references a whole web of traditions and objects in thinking about design. But I saw primarily the recognizable object as an excuse to think about shape and color and variation in material process that led to objects whose beauty seemed to have nothing to do with anything other than themselves and their endless transformations. And Scarpa's work really was a revelation for me. If you can go to the next slide.
Right.
As with, As with Schendel, my poem addresses various techniques that Scarpa used with the artisans to create his glassworks. And the first two related to techniques are the Bollicini and Sommersi, which means kind of bubbles and submersed. And if we look at the next slide, we get an example of actually the Sommersi. What Scarpa would do would create glass that would have bubbles, some big, some little, and you'll see bubbles when we get to the next slide. What he would do is have the vessels would be blown, and then occasionally he would have gold leaf or other colors added to the surface, and then the vessel would be re-dipped in molten glass. So what happens when you do that is you get this variation of color and or with gold leaf that seems to float somewhere between the surface of the vessel and a depth that you can't quite see. And if we go to the next slide, he did the same thing here, just with gold leaf, but here you have a better sense of the bubbles of the Bollicini technique. And a lot of the glasswork using this technique resembled ancient Chinese bronzes and jades. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see the first page of my poem that addresses this technique. So on this page, and actually throughout the first section of my poem, the Scarpa poem, I looked for letter forms that on their own or pattern would recall Scarpa's shapes and colors and the juxtapositions created by the exhibition layout. The point isn't so much to comment or to translate into some sort of word sense different aspects of the work, as it was in my Schendel poem, but to render visible as letters and letter forms, that is, as language material first and foremost, aspects of the visual and aesthetic experience I got from Scarpa's work. So ekphrasis here as adapting in the new medium the material resistance of the original. So letters are liberated from words, useless now, meaningless, absolute, in the same way as the glass works, and hopefully is beautiful. The book is a total expansion of the letter, to steal a phrase from poet Stephen Mallarmé. So on this page, you have the color green, which was by far the most common color for these kinds of glassworks. And also the shapes recall vaguely, without losing their material and visible existence as letters, the glassworks that use the Bollicini and Sommersi techniques, as well as the space of the exhibition. So on this page, the tension between flat pattern and smaller figures seen alongside or through the others gestures towards the exhibition space. There's a balance of shape, of space, of distance that's absolute and without sense. Nothing left to say other than to look. And that's kind of my ideal for the pages where I'm not using words, is that there's nothing left to say other than look. We go to the next page, which is the second page of my Scarpa poem. This page is kind of gesturing towards the endless transformation of Scarpa's different glassworks, or being surprised by repetition with difference that I talked about earlier. There's clear visible echoes between the letter I and J, but also with the Fs of the previous page. This page also contrasts with the previous page. Here, all the letters are recognizable, as I just said, as the letter that they are, and they appear on the same plane. So it's more difficult, other than with the color, to see the actual glassworks that they're referencing. Yet it's easier to see space, interval, rhythm, and implied pattern, like seeing the space and spacing of the whole exhibit. It's easier also, paradoxically, to see the letter as both a letter and as a purely graphic and rhythmic form. The spacing and repetition and groupings separate the heads of the characters from their bodies. The dots become rhythm and connection, if not objects on their own. It depends on whether you read the pages as a series of I's and J's, or whether you see it as a unit, as a graphic image. And if we move to the next page, we're actually going to move to the second set of works by Scarpa, which were his Chinese vases. And in this series, you can move to the next page, Thoreau. Beautiful, isn't it? In this series, Scarpa directly references and reinterprets classical Chinese vases. His vessels look like glass. They look like ceramic, but they're actually still glass. So he uses a different medium that imitates, but not quite another, makes reference to an ancient and central tradition, shapes and colors, but in a different medium. And he reworks these to a greater or lesser degrees. So there's a reference to and a usurpation of a source. There's also a purity and a simplicity of a line that's stunning. If you move to the next slide, Thoreau, you can clearly see that Chinese reference and also just the absolute beauty of his line. Here. So there's an endless circulation of shapes and colors and forms in his work that I'm hoping you can kind of see here. That's nearly atemporal, kind of like an alphabet. So this section of work posed a problem about how to react to it, given the layers of tradition and reworking. So I actually turned to the sonnet. And if you go to the next page, Thoreau. For me, this section of my poem on Scarpa, reference and usurpation are my working methods. And the sonnet is the way to do that. So the sonnet is a very recognizable form. It's an old traditional form, but it's immediately recognizable by its shape on the page. Yes, also by rhyme and meter, but primarily by the way it looks. It's a form that has been continuously reinterpreted since it appeared in the early Renaissance, and in many ways is Western poetry, or can kind of stand in for it, much like the Chinese vase for whoever in any tradition wants to make another vase. The three sonnets, in fact, I chose 3 of them, all teeter on the edge of modernity and date from the middle to 19th century France. I chose French sonnets because they're not in English, which is the supposed language of this poem in my book. Thus, they're recognizable as sonnets visibly, but not necessarily either in terms of their tradition or in terms of their content or language, unless you happen to read French. So they're recognized as sonnets because they look like sonnets. And I chose each of these 3 sonnets specifically. The first one, which you see here, is Baudelaire's famous sonnet about beauty. In fact, each sonnet references an earlier tradition or thinks about questions related to art and tradition. So Baudelaire's sonnet on beauty, if you go to the next slide, Thoreau. It may be hard to recognize, but this is Mallarmé's sonnet on X. It's called on X because he has a rhyme in YX or IX that runs through the poem. It's a poem that kind of hollows out its language as it builds it. In an earlier version, Mallarmé himself said that the words echo each other so much that they cancel themselves out. And then the third sonnet, if you go to the next slide, is Gerard de Nerval's Delphica, which loosely translates and reworks an earlier poem by Goethe and also refers to the returning pass. So each of these poems also has lines that could be made to describe elements of Scarpa's work. A Baudelaire sonnet contains the lines, beautiful, O mortals, like a dream of stone, and beauty that hates the movement that displaces the lines. Mallarmé's sonnet has the line, which I'm going to give you first in French, abolie bibelot d'inanité sonore, which can be translated as abolished bibelot of sonorous inaneous, which in French is the perfect matching of sound and sense. form and content. The poem also creates its own word, tics, which doesn't exist, which is literally an empty vase on an empty credenza. And Nerval's sonnet has the line, and nothing has disturbed the severe portico, which gets at, for me, some of the kind of absolute severity of Scarpa's shapes, particularly in the Chinese vase sections. So these 19th century French reworkings of French and English and Italian tradition are then altered by me, given a new shape, as you saw as we went through, in which the old shape is still visible. So the three sonnets are first given separately, as you saw. Beauty, the kind of self-reflecting be below of language from Mallarmé, and then the return of the past and lyric song for the one you're looking at now. There's a line in this about this love song that keeps coming back. And I asked myself if one of the reasons this sonnet isn't shaped, but instead it's crossed out, is my kind of allergic reaction to the lyric. And then through the rest of this section, the sonnets are recombined visually in ways that stress their visibility and their recognizable shape, alongside other shapes, both solid and negative. If you turn to the next page, Thoreau, this is the last page of my Scarpa section. So you can see the three sonnets. They're not easy to read, in part because they're upside down or they're reversed, or both. It's also very difficult to see what is form and what is ground, what is filled, what is full and what is empty, particularly with the use of white as being both solid and blank. And that's a way of also pulling the paper up between the words and between the stanzas to make them as material as what we kind of normally print on. So that's an example of how my poems, two I think very different examples, react to extract, transliterate elements of the artwork. I like to think that they stand on their own, but I also do think, because they are deeply involved with looking at and thinking about other medium, that they can become slightly more comprehensible by being seen alongside kind of what has inspired them. And I've been getting reports back from some of the people who have received my book that they find it very beautiful, but they don't know what to do. So I'm hoping maybe you will know a little bit more what to do now. And that like my presentation has shown, that there are no explanations but in things, in this case in art and pages. I want to look, I want to read, I want to write as if those two acts are the same, and they're not. I want to cling to the letter of things. To cite Roger Giroux, who's a poet whose pages are really crucial to what I do, quote, "The absence of writing is my work," unquote. In this absence, in all the blank, in the gaps page after page of my book, there's space, I hope, for you to do with what you will or won't. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. I'm going to need to take a second and do some Zoom stuff. I wasn't able to let people in to the meeting while you were talking because it kept interrupting. So just give me a second. I'll take care of that. Okay, it looks like they gave up and maybe we'll come back soon. So it was so nice to hear that. When I was working on putting your book together, it really was, I had a similar experience to what you were just describing some of your friends saying. I found the poems visually stunning and the progress of the poems through the book surprising and joyful even. But I really had a hard time imagining how they related back to the poetry, to the visual art they were responding to. So this presentation really helped me to do that. So just want to make sure that I haven't, that I'm unmuted. You guys can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect, great. Because I was muted during the presentation. I just had a little crisis of doubt that I had forgot to unmute myself. So in a moment, we're going to be joined by Zen monk, poet, and translator Ninzo John Hai. I asked John to join this conversation for a couple of reasons. First, it was while working on his book, Without Dragons, Even the Emperor Would Be Lonely, that I first became aware of Michael's work. But more importantly, John and Micheal have been engaged in a long, perhaps inspired and perhaps twisted conversation about writing and art for decades. And in their creative work, they're both pushing the boundaries of how writing and meaning attract and repel each other, and in the process create a new space that they can inhabit and explore. I also don't think it's a coincidence that it's also no coincidence that their ongoing conversation, which we are about to get a chance to listen in on, has been fueled by the fact that they are both translators, John from the Russian and Micheal from the French, and that they have explored deeply how thinking about expression and representation and meaning has and is mutating through these languages and literary traditions. So please welcome Nenzo John Hai, who's joining us from Brooklyn.
Hi, Micheal. It was a really powerful and moving presentation, and to really coincide with what Thoreau said over the past 15 or 20 years. I've loved seeing your work evolve, and I think in the process of our conversations about poetry and language, they have become a very meaningful part to my own work as a writer, and to how I think about language, translation, transposition, naming. So it's really particularly gratifying to have your book here in my hands right now. I mean, it's a draft, but nonetheless, it's a beautiful piece. Let me begin with the question, the most basic of questions that you've talked about, but I want to come back to it again of what visual or visible poetry means for you. How does it manifest, if you will, in still forms? I know this seems like such an obvious question, but at the same time, in these stunning poems, they seem anything but still. For me, in fact, they appear alive with an almost frenetic linguistic energy, what I think of as a verbal chi. Although there is, at times it occurs to me, a feeling of a movement and a rest, as the Gnostics sometimes speak in regard to contemplation and prayer. Often a sense of what in Zen is somewhat fondly referred to as a stillness within movement. But I was wondering, as for me and for us, if you could say a few more words about this process of you in the visual or visible poetry, and how it means for you, what it means for you.
I struggled a lot with the visual. I think Thoreau had originally suggested visual. I've also referred to my stuff as spatial before, though with the format of Thoreau's books, there was less space for the letters to move around in. And I also think spatial no longer matches as much what I'm trying to do and refers to a whole other tradition that I'm related to, particularly with French poetry, but not entirely participating in. And so visible for me has a more material sense. I don't know if it's true than visual. And so one of the things I'm interested in is making visible all the things we usually don't look at when we read. And this is not anything original. It goes back at least to Mallarmé, if not longer. But the page, the turn of the page, the letters, the space between the letters, the physical shape of the poem on the page, all those kinds of things. And so for me, visible had that had a concreteness to it, a materiality to it that visual doesn't. Now, of course, a poem is primarily a visible object. Particularly once you've gotten rid of rhyme and meter, there's no way to recognize a poem, particularly if it's read out loud, other than seeing it on the page, because a poem has a very specific visible footprint. So I was thinking kind of along those lines and that materiality. And in terms of the title of the book, I also struggled with that a lot. I think the first reference, and I'll get back to what you were talking about in terms of life and stuff, is a reference to still life painting because of the visual aspects of the book. And when put back in the square format, a lot of my pages, the letters were centered in a way they weren't necessarily in the earlier versions of them. So they felt much more like a painting in a way, or a visual object than they may have been in the original. And I liked them a lot. There's no critique, but it's a different experience, I think, in this format than it would have been in the earlier one. So there was that reference. But I was also thinking of the word still as an adverb. Like there are still forms. If you get rid of words, there are still forms. And that reminds me of a line of Sohn from, I think the poem is Thread Sons, where he says there are still songs to be sung on the other side of mankind. If you get rid of words, you get rid of sense, there's still these forms, these letters. And then I was also thinking of still as a verb, right? Which is kind of addressing what you said before, right? To make still, to slow down, to stop those words from disappearing into a sentence and then into a sense, or to stop the letters from disappearing into a word, into a phrase, and into a sense. So to slow things, to still things, to distill things, until all you're left with is the letter and then the spatial and rhythmic relationships between them. So that's kind of what I was thinking as you're doing this. And if you think about the difficulty of reading, which is one of the things Thoreau talked about in his introduction, that yes, you cannot read my poems, or at least the later poems, in the way that you would normally think about reading, but there are still forms. There are still things to look at. There's still some kinds of songs to be sung on the other side of mankind, as Sohn said. So that's kind of what I was thinking with the title. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, it at least helps evoke the next question. Because now you're taking me back about 10 years ago. You and I are sitting on the Seine River in Paris, and we're quite near where Paul Celan threw himself off the bridge and ended his quite beautiful passage in poetry. I'm not sure if I remember what we were talking about, but I do remember the poem that we were talking about, which was Paul Celan writing, speak you to, say out your say, speak as the last. Speak you to, say out your say, speak as the last. Is anything being said in this poetry in still forms?
I'm not sure I followed that question. In terms of Celan or in terms of speaking your last?
Either would be fine.
There's maybe some of that in Schendel, the Schendel section of my poem, because there are still words. She was interested in Zen, in different spiritual and philosophical practices, part of that whole 60s and 70s Brazilian art movement that she was involved in. And Celan, who was a major influence, I think, in my much earlier poetry. I mean, he's still there in the later poetry, but he's harder to see. If he appears at all, it's much more there, and much more there also in terms of the play of sound and sense, like I was talking about with the page with the H's, which is one of the things that Celan, I mean, I can't read German, but one of the things that Celan was interested in doing. But I think he's still coming from a very oral tradition, right? That poetry is something that is meant to be said or sung. For me, poetry is something that is meant to be read. Doesn't mean that you can't speak it and you can't sing it, right? But it needs to be read and seen on the page. And I'm not entirely sure Celan's work works into that way. But his interest in the material nature of the word, going back to etymologies, to sound, I mean, the things you can do with German that you can't do with English because of its agglutinative nature. His multilingual Yiddish, Romanian, French, I mean, all that kind of stuff, yes, definitely. in terms of crushing language, grinding it down to get at the parts you can't grind down any smaller. For me, those are the letters. That's the only thing that's left, right? He doesn't quite get that far, but he gets
Pretty close.
down there. Yeah, yeah.
It's
Yeah.
pretty close,
Particularly in the late poems. Yeah.
especially in the last year.
Yeah.
If I have time, I wanted to ask you about Thoreau. Do I have another moment or two?
Sure, John. Yeah, why don't you do one more question, then I've got a couple of questions I would like to ask as well.
What is the relationship between the scene and the sound and still forms? Sometimes I feel that the words or signs or images are a kind of echo of the actual roots or letters of the sounds themselves. But there is some kind of relationship. And I was wondering if you could just say a little more about that. And
For the Schendel poem, definitely. Like the page I spoke about, I think one of the page that's on the back of the book, which you can see on the website, that has the scribble. If you can show that, John, might be hard to read. The word above that, it's immediate with the im and then the mediate in the middle and then the scribble. There's again a play of pulling a word apart, of sound, im, I'm, and certainly that H page I talked about with the play of the visual look of the H, but also whether it's a breath or the pause before breath, right? Whether you aspirate or not. You can still see that in the Schendel. I think in the Scarpa poem, my interest in the letters, for the most part, is purely visual. I was trying to look for visual equivalents to aspects of his artwork. And so I'm looking for letters that have certain shapes, that are sharp or that are curved, and less interested in sounds. But some of my recent work, I'm really working with that. Words are generating themselves out of clusters of letters that are either rearranged. So the meaning comes afterwards. If the words kind of generate out of themselves, and then I got to go back and check to make sure that it says something that is gesturing in a general direction of sense. Or in some texts, I'm breaking words apart. But the parts that get isolated are precisely the parts you can't pronounce. They're often silent parts of the word. You can only pronounce connected to the first or the other. So it brings the visual nature up at a moment that you can't pronounce. Or like Zukowski, I'll take a line, like he did with Mallarmé. He also did with Catullus. I'll take a line from the, I'll take a line and translate it into words that sound like the words in the original line, but are different, right? So there's a whole play of that in the kind of more contemporary work. It's harder to do that with the letters. I mean, you could say that Scarpa's vessels are glass, and I used a lot of letters that have hard sounds or the that opened your mouth. But I'm not sure I was kind of thinking about that as much when I was working on that. It was much more the kind of visual shape of the letters.
That's great. You and I could go on for hours, but Thoreau, let me turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, John. That was really interesting. I think there's at least one question that might pop up in chat. I've been looking at the chat transcript, and so far what I've seen is, congratulations, book looks wonderful. Where's my book? I bought it a month ago and I haven't gotten it yet. You know, stuff like that. But I think there's a question coming through that, see if I can read it here. So I'm just going to read this, bear with me. So I'm interested in the tension between the explicability of the gestures of these poems, demonstrated by Micheal's compelling explication, and their indecipherability. How does Mike account for the potentiality of these forms of meaning, and what is the relation of that potentiality to the grounded meaning of the poems in their subtexts and Mike's modes of response?
Yeah,
that's a lot of question.
I'm not really interested in meaning. I've kind of given up on that. It's too difficult. Right? In an earlier version of the introduction to this, I talked about finding something to express and finding the means to express it is just, it's too hard, right? And there are better uses of your time. So there's, I mean, not to take that question lightly, but once I'd moved away from words to letters, I wasn't thinking so much in terms of meaning as I was in terms of transposition of certain sensible experiences, right, of the artwork, at least for those. I use that word transposition purposely, mostly to irk John, because I do not see them as translations. And the Schendel poem, yes, I was also trying to translate my thinking about her work. And part of her work comes from, there's a certain indecipherability of it. It's multilingual, it dabbles in a whole bunch of different, often conflicting traditions. It's material, there are mystical aspects to it. And so I was trying to translate elements of those, right? Move them over and allow them to keep moving when they move to my poem. But in the letter poems, I'm really trying to transpose, take, lift, and put down in a way that holds solid material elements of experience, limiting myself mostly to, like I said, letter forms, and then often other purely graphic splashes of color and stuff like that.
So here's a kind of refinement of that question also from chat. So if not meaning, what about beauty? What's your conception of beauty? You mentioned something about beauty in the Scarpa piece, I think. Do you have a constructivist or post-lyric conception of beauty?
I'm not sure what that means. No, honestly, I'm not sure what that means.
So what about beauty versus meaning? Is beauty something you're also running away from as fast as you possibly can?
In my present work, yes. I'm trying very hard to write ugly sentences or ugly combinations of words, right? That's also one of the ways of getting the visible and materiality things. I'm interested maybe, I mean, I use the beauty a lot for Scarpa because with him, and you might say this also about Mallarmé, there's a kind of almost 19th century absolute sense of this object fallen from the sky, or and that's just like in Baudelaire's poem, that it's a dream of stone, and that it's beauty hates the movement that displaces the lines. For me, maybe beauty is the wrong word. It's a sense of visual unity of the page that holds together. Whereas, as I think I said with the Scarpa, there's nothing to say, you can only look. I find that, I guess I find that beautiful, if I had to use that word. Schendel's work is not necessarily beautiful in the way that we would normally think of it, but I guess I find it that way. I mean, beauty is one of those words, I mean, I think the question is alluding to that you need to define within a certain tradition, and I'm not quite sure where my definition would be. I want the pages to hold together, and I want them to stop you from talking. So whether that experience is beauty or terror that does that, or completely not knowing what to do, then I'm fine with that.
Yeah. So I got two sort of more basic questions. There's a lot of variety of artists that you draw on in this book. I mean, from ceramicists to architects, sculpture, painting. Do you choose the artists, or do they choose you?
Unfortunately, so far I've been the one choosing them. So it's just people I've stumbled across, exhibits I went to that either immediately or sometimes a year or two later stopped me in my tracks and felt like I needed to find a way to react to them. Shows I discovered in galleries that I went on then to look at other work online, like this happened with the last section of my book about Anne Slassic. So I've been choosing them, and it's whatever happens to strike me in some ways. I mean, I'm interested in frequently in painting that skirts the question of abstraction and figuration, because that's what a word is, right? A word both sits on the fence of being an abstraction, physical, material abstraction, and it's connected to that goddamn meaning it has, or in fact, several if you look it up in the dictionary. And so often my interests in art head in that direction, because they allow me then to kind of think about language. And sometimes it's also a challenge. I really like this show. How would I be able to transpose it using just letter forms or using some combination of words and letter forms?
And then the last question that I have is, you've talked a lot about, what you're doing and kind of why you're doing it. But what about the how you're doing it? How do you actually make these pieces? I mean, through, what kind of technology, what kind of process do you use?
Not the good ones. I started ages ago. I would use AppleWorks. I would use Microsoft Word 5, because I could open up a drawing document and then I could put words wherever I wanted, flip them around, and then paste it into a regular Word document. And that was great until Microsoft took away a lot of that freedom. They wanted to make it easier for you, and so it was all prefab. So then I started using AppleWorks, which doesn't exist anymore. In fact, I kept a 15-year-old computer carried around with me just to be able to do my poems on that. And then that computer eventually died. So in fact, the last poem I did on that computer is the last poem in the book, the Anslastic. The work I'm working on now, I've been using Pages, but it's much more shaped prose. It's very different than what's in the book. I haven't yet gone back to doing letter form work yet, so I don't yet know if Pages is up for that. I really should get a desktop publishing program. I think would open up many more avenues. But one of the things that was good is frustration. I often would have an image of a page and I couldn't get the damn computer to do what I wanted. But often the solution ended up being as interesting, if not more. The limitations is, I think my poems, if you see more of them that are in the book, they can begin to start to look the same. And some of that is style, but some of that's also the limitations of the technology. If I twist too much, it doesn't look good, like those kinds of things.
Well, that's fascinating. I think there is something about using anachronistic technology to try to do, it's almost returns it to a manual form of art creation. Rather than what you were saying about the newer versions of Word where it's all automated and you push a few buttons and it does what it does, but you can't get it to do anything else.
Yeah, I often refer to the letter, when I talk about the letter poems, I often will tell people I've fabricated this. Yeah. I don't even use the word writing, because I think of it as writing, but it does feel much more artisanal, right? I mean, I know Yeats talks about getting down on your knees and breaking stones and how hard it is, and he's right to put a line of poetry together. But this really does feel like you're moving things around, you're sticking them together. It feels much more artisanal.
Yeah, well, that's certainly how it felt when I was working on the pieces in the book. So I think with that, we should move on or wrap up. So I want to thank John for your questions. It was informative and wonderful to sort of dip into your
Thank you, John.
Michael's ongoing conversation. If only we could all be on the banks of the Seine listening to you guys, we would be in a different kind of world, wouldn't it? But mostly I want to thank you guys, everyone who came and watched this. Thank you so much for that. And to remind you that you can pick up a copy of Michael's book if you don't already have one by going to our website, and on the page, on the bookshop page, there's a little link for the discounts. And so rather than giving you that discount code again, just click on that link and it'll take you to the page that shows you the current discounts. It'll make it a lot easier for everyone. So our next kitchen table reading is scheduled for Thursday, June 11th, and it's going to feature Andrea Clark-Libben in conversation with Doretta Lau and Maya Bushell. So hopefully you can all join us for that as well. And I think what I'm going to do now is go ahead and thank you all again and unmute everyone if I can clear the blockage on my screen. Unmute everyone so you all can say your hellos and goodbyes to Micheal. So thanks again.
Where are you, Micheal?
Hello. Thank you all for coming. Hey,
That was really great.
Yes,
David, Susan.
See you, Micheal.
Good to
Alright.
see you
Micheal.
too.
Awesome, Micheal.
Hello.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Will you autograph my book?
Do you have $5? Do you have $5?
Okay.
For Sohn.
If I could ever make it back to Boston.
All right. I'm looking forward to seeing you here.
I am too.
Kara, it was beautiful.
Thank you.
Can't wait to see this book, Micheal.
Some people didn't have their camera.
Hopefully, Kevin, hopefully it'll be coming soon.
Yes, my hands are itching.
It is coming, Micheal. Trust me.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
All right.
Michael.
Yeah, listen to Kara.
Bye, Micheal.
Bye.
Hello.
Hey, Micheal.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Is Ian with you?
Yeah, she's with me, but she's camera shy today.
All right. Tell her hello from us.
Hello. Thanks for us.
All right. Is that Ian's parents here?
Yes, they're there.
All right.
Let's
Say hi to us too. Okay.
Lynn Larson.
All right. Yeah. All right, honey. See you next time. Next book. All right. Is another one out?
Bye.
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 Hi, David, Susan.
Micheal, congratulations.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Bye,
Thank
guys.
you. Bye.
Bye, Micheal.
Bye.
Bye, Micheal.
Bye, Kent. Hi, Jill, Barbara, Eric.
Thanks, Michael, from Annie and Frederick in Marseille.
Oh, thank you. I didn't see you.
Yeah,
We're
I see
off,
your name.
we're off camera.
it's late here.
You guys should be in bed.
No, you should be drinking pastis.
Oh, that's done.
Thank you for coming.
Talk to you soon.
I think in the future, I'm going to make 3.
I know, it's a little skippy. Well, you could do that now.
It's too late. Next time on.
Hi, Jen.
Hi, Michael.
Oh, hi, Jen.
It was beautiful. Very, very
you.
beautiful. I still see it on canvas.
I got good quality.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
Big.
Yeah, that's what I want to know. How do I get it on a big print?
I don't know. Pay me a lot of money and I'll figure it out.
All right, where do I send my check?
You know, Michael, I have a neighbor who now, not a neighbor, somebody on the next street who does a lot of wordplay on canvas.
Well, Andrew, if you send me the page you want, I can send you a PDF of it and you can probably have it printed up.
Huh, all right. Because I got my book right away, but that's probably because of my proximity to Berkeley.
Yeah. So let me know which page and I'll send it to you. And I'll expect free legal help later in my life.
I think your poem's going to be worth much more than my legal help.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thanks, Andrew.
Bye.
Thanks for coming.
Okay, well, I think I'm going to go ahead and end the recording.
Excellent, love.
Bye. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Bye.
I see you, Mom, but I can't hear you.
Bye.
That's good. It's every son's dream.